The crystalline halls of the Galactic Federation Academy of Xenobiology amplified every footstep, much to Madison Brooks' annoyance. Her standard-issue combat boots, necessary wear for anyone from a high-gravity world, created sharp echoes that sent ripples of unease through the alien students around her. She wasn't trying to be intimidating. That's just what happened when you put 180 pounds of muscle and bone from a Deathworld into a building designed for species that evolved in 1/3 Earth's gravity. "Please proceed with caution," chirped her orientation guide, a hovering orb that pulsed with soft blue light. "Your mass exceeds standard structural tolerances for most Academy furniture." Madison resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Yeah, got the memo after the last 3 briefings. She'd already been handed a tablet full of warnings about her excessive density and potentially harmful locomotive force. The Academy treated every human like a walking natural disaster. The floating orb led her into Lecture Hall 7, where her new classmates were already assembled for orientation. Madison paused in the doorway, taking in the variety of alien life forms. A group of crystalline beings that looked like animated geodes clustered near the front, their faceted bodies refracting light across the room. Several tentacled creatures hung from the ceiling, their color-shifting skin displaying what she assumed were anxiety patterns at her arrival. In the back, a collection of more humanoid aliens sat rigid in their seats, extra sets of eyes all fixed on her. "Welcome, Earth Being Brooks," announced Professor Kirkstall, a towering insectoid whose iridescent carapace sparkled under the room's soft lighting. "Please select a seating unit and join your fellow students." Madison headed for an empty desk, trying to move as smoothly as possible. The desk's material, some sort of advanced composite, was supposedly unbreakable. She lowered herself carefully into the seat, which immediately creaked in protest. Crack! The sound of splintering material shot through the room like a gunshot. Several floating students instinctively jetted toward the ceiling as Madison found herself holding the broken pieces of her unbreakable desk. "Oh, for few. I mean, my apologies, Professor," Madison said, feeling her face flush. "I can pay for that." Professor Kirkstall's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "No need. You're not the first human to exceed our furniture's structural limits. Please take one of the reinforced seats in the back." As Madison settled into her new, sturdier chair, the professor began the orientation presentation. "Welcome to the most prestigious xenobiology program in the galaxy. Each of you represents the finest scientific minds your species has to offer." The professor's compound eyes swept the room. "This year's curriculum will challenge you in ways you cannot imagine, culminating in our practical examination, a comprehensive field study of a living specimen from our xenozoological preserve." Holoprojections sprang to life around the room, showing various alien creatures in their habitats. Madison leaned forward, her embarrassment forgotten as she watched footage of massive beasts and microscopic swarms. "I must warn you," the professor continued, "that this program has a 30% dropout rate. Last year's human student departed after a single day." The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to Madison. She felt her lips curl into a slight smirk. Back on Earth, she'd tracked mountain lions through the Rockies and studied pack behavior in African painted dogs. Whatever made that other human quit, it wouldn't stop her. Now, Professor Kirkstall's mandibles clacked together sharply. Who would like to demonstrate their species' unique biological capabilities? "We'll start with..." Crack! Madison's reinforced chair gave way with a sound like a small explosion. As she picked herself up from the floor, she caught the professor's multifaceted gaze. "Well," she said, brushing off her uniform, "I guess I just demonstrated one of humanity's special traits. We break stuff really well." The tension in the room broke as several students emitted various species versions of laughter. Even the professor's antennae twitched in what might have been amusement. Madison smiled. Maybe this semester wouldn't be so bad after all. "The drachnid moth demonstrates remarkable bioluminescence," groaned Professor Kirkstall, gesturing to a delicate creature floating in the preserve's observation feed. An excellent choice for preliminary study, Zexifith. Madison suppressed a yawn as her tentacled classmate wobbled excitedly. For the past hour, students had been selecting their research subjects from the Academy's safe specimen list. So far, she'd watched her colleagues choose everything from six-legged herbivores to floating crystalline organisms that looked like wind chimes. Perhaps our Earth being would like to select next. The professor's compound eyes fixed on Madison. There are several specimens well suited to your durability level. Madison was about to respond when movement on one of the restricted zone feeds caught her eye. The image showed only empty jungle, but something about the way the foliage swayed made her pulse quicken. Years of tracking predators had taught her to trust that instinct. Can you rewind that feed? The one from section R7. The professor's antennae twitched nervously. That area is not available for student projects. It contains specimens deemed too dangerous for. There. Madison pointed as the footage played back. What she'd spotted wasn't so much a movement as a distortion, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. But in its wake, she saw massive claw marks appearing in solid rock. Fascinating, she breathed. What is that? That would be a Novarian shadow beast. The professor's voice dropped an octave. A Class 12 apex predator capable of manipulating spatial dimensions, highly intelligent, extremely aggressive, and absolutely not available for study. Madison couldn't tear her eyes from the screen. The creature seemed to bend reality around itself, appearing as barely more than a shimmer before materializing just long enough to leave evidence of its devastating power. It hunts like a snow leopard, she murmured, using dimensional shifts the way Earth cats use terrain. I don't know what a snow leopard is, Zexivith burbled anxiously, but shadow beasts are why we lost our last 3 xenobiologists. They don't just kill, they treat it like a game. A grin spread across Madison's face. Perfect. I want that one. The resulting chaos was immediate. Zexivith fainted, his tentacles turning a sickly shade of green as he slumped to the floor. The crystalline students emitted high-pitched tones that nearly shattered the observation screens. Even Professor Karkstall's carapace paled several shades. Absolutely not. The professor's mandibles clicked rapidly. The shadow beast is beyond even human durability. No one has survived more than 10 minutes of direct observation. Madison stood, her eyes still fixed on the feed, where another reality-bending distortion rippled through the jungle. With all due respect, Professor, those observers probably relied on your standard tech, observation pods, force fields, energy barriers. But look at those dimensional shifts. The beast isn't just passing through space. It's reading and manipulating energy fields. That's how it hunts. She turned to face the class, her expression intense. But humans? We spent millions of years as both predator and prey. Before we had technology, we tracked things that could kill us with nothing but our instincts and our minds. Let me study this creature the old way. No force fields, no energy pods. Just skill, patience, and respect for a fellow predator. You want to observe the galaxy's most dangerous hunter without protective equipment. Professor Karkstall's antennae went completely rigid. And you wish to do this at night as well. Best time to observe predators, Madison shrugged. They're more active, more natural in their behavior. Besides, she added with a slight smirk, humans see better in low light than most species think we do. Another leftover from our predator days. The professor's mandibles worked silently for a moment. Finally, they spoke. You understand that if you die, it will create a diplomatic incident. Madison's grin widened. Trust me, Professor. This isn't my first dance with an apex predator. Though, she admitted, watching another boulder get sliced to ribbons on the feed, it might be my most interesting one. This is highly irregular. The Academy's safety officer, a towering arachnoid named Valanox, shuddered as she watched Madison unpack her gear. Our regulations require all students to use standard observation equipment. Madison didn't look up as she continued laying out what appeared to be primitive tools, lengths of camouflage fabric, containers of dark mud, and various plant materials she'd collected from the Academy's botanical gardens. The preparation room's sterile white walls made her earthy collection look almost offensive. With respect, Officer Valnox, Madison said, mixing something pungent in a bowl. Your standard equipment will get me killed faster than going in naked. She dipped a finger in the mixture and sniffed it. Perfect. Smells just like rotting vegetation. Zexvith, who had insisted on observing the preparation despite his obvious terror, rippled various shades of green. Why would you want to smell like decay? Because, Madison explained while stripping down to her base layer, predators notice anything that doesn't belong. Your observation pods. They smell like metal and energy. Force fields. They distort natural air currents. But this, she started applying the mud mixture to her skin and clothes. This makes me part of the environment. Fascinating, Professor Kekrikstal said, entering the room. You're using camouflage techniques similar to Earth's indigenous peoples, mixed with some tricks I learned tracking jaguars in Brazil. Madison nodded. The key isn't to be invisible, it's to be forgettable, something the predator's brain registers as background noise. Valnox's multiple eyes blinked in sequence, but our sensors indicate the shadow beast hunts primarily through detecting dimensional anomalies and energy signatures. Surely your primitive methods want to bet. Madison interrupted, now thoroughly covered in the mud mixture. Computer, display a standard observation pod in this room. A holographic pod appeared. Madison pointed to various spots on it. See these power nodes. The energy containment field. The beast doesn't just sense them, it uses them. Watch this. She pulled out a handheld scanner she'd borrowed from the physics department. Computer, simulate pod activation. The scanner lit up with complex energy patterns. These are the same dimensional signatures we see in the shadow beast hunting pattern. It's not just avoiding our technology. It's learning from it, using our own protective measures to predict where observers will be. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Even Valnox's mandibles stopped clicking. That's why no one's lasted more than 10 minutes. Madison continued, now weaving local plants into her mud-covered clothes. The beast isn't just hunting observers, it's using their own technology to outmaneuver them. But me? She grinned, her teeth startlingly white against her mud-covered face. I'll be about as high-tech as a rock. This is madness, Valnox declared. Professor, surely you can't allow. Actually, Professor Kekrikstal interrupted, antennae twitching thoughtfully. I'm beginning to understand. Humans didn't evolve with advanced technology. They survived as both predators and prey using purely biological adaptations. Perhaps this organic approach might work where our methods have failed. Madison finished her preparations by braiding her hair tight against her scalp. The mud covering had dried, transforming her from a clean-cut academy student into something that looked like it had grown from the forest floor. One last thing, she said, pulling out a primitive knife made of volcanic glass. When Valnox started to protest, Madison held up a hand. It's not a weapon, it's a tool. No metal, no power source, nothing the beast can sense. Just obsidian, wood, and sinew. You've done this before, Professor Kekrikstal observed. This isn't just theory for you. Madison's expression grew serious. 2 years tracking a man-eating tiger in Nepal. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. She stood, her movements suddenly different. Smoother, quieter, more primal. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with a dimensional predator. As she left the prep room, Zexvith's tentacles curled anxiously. Is she insane or brilliant? Professor Kekrikstal watched her go, mandibles clicking softly. Perhaps, my young friend, she's a bit of both. And perhaps that's exactly what we need. The jungle pulsed with alien life as Madison crouched in her carefully constructed blind. 3 hours had passed since sunset, and the preserve's twin moons cast competing shadows through the canopy. In the observation room, Her classmates watched through thermal cameras as she remained perfectly still, barely breathing. How can she stay so motionless? Deathworlder whispered, his tentacles coiled tightly in anxiety. Even her heat signature barely fluctuates. Professor Kirkstall's compound eyes reflected the monitor's glow. Human hunters once waited days for their prey. They called it persistence hunting. Most fascinating. The professor fell silent as Madison's hand moved fractionally, touching the ground. Through the cameras, they watched as she lifted her fingers, examining something invisible to their sensors. Movement log, whispered subsonic. She breathed, her voice barely audible. Gravitational displacement patterns in the soil. It's been here within the last hour. And it's learning. A ripple of unease passed through the observation room. The way Madison said learning made several students' chromatophores pale. Computer, enhance quadrant 7, Professor Kirkstall commanded. The display zoomed in on a patch of ground that looked completely normal to alien eyes. Madison's hand moved again, this time touching a fallen leaf. The displacement patterns are changing. First pass was chaotic, but these marks. She traced something invisible to the cameras. It's adapting its dimensional shifts to match the local gravity wells. Getting more efficient, more precise. Suddenly, every sensor in the preserve screamed to life. Reality seemed to bend inward 3 meters from Madison's position. The shadow beast didn't so much appear as tear its way into normal space, its form rippling like heat waves over desert sand. By the first nest, Zexivith burbled in terror. It's right there. But Madison didn't move. She didn't even flinch as the creature's massive form solidified. In the camera's light, they could finally see it clearly. 12 feet of rippling muscle, covered in what looked like living shadows. Its head bore no eyes, just sensory pits that spiraled down its elongated skull. When it opened its mouth, they glimpsed rows of teeth that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. The beast turned directly toward Madison's blind. It knows she's there, one of the crystalline students chimed in panic. She has to run. No, Professor Kirkstall's antennae went rigid. Look at her biosigns. She's not afraid. She's excited. In her blind, Madison remained motionless as the shadow beast approached. It moved like liquid darkness, each step distorting the space around it. When it reached her blind, it paused. Those eyeless sensory pits pointed directly at her location. Then Madison did something that made several students faint. She looked directly into those sensory pits and smiled. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered. The shadow beast's head tilted, almost like a curious dog. It shifted slightly, and suddenly its face was inches from Madison's. One wrong move would put her head right between those interdimensional teeth. "That's right," Madison continued, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I see you. Question is, do you see me?" The creature's sensory pits flexed. In the observation room, instruments went crazy as it generated micro-dimensional rifts, apparently trying to understand what it was seeing, or rather, what it wasn't seeing. Madison's natural camouflage and lack of technology had confused its hunting patterns. Then it did something unprecedented. It pulled back slightly and mirrored Madison's head tilt. "Mother of moons," Professor Kirkstall breathed. "It's not hunting. It's investigating." The moment stretched like elastic, human and beast, locked in a stance that was neither predator nor prey. Then, with a ripple of reality, the shadow beast vanished. Madison let out a long, slow breath. "Movement log, addendum," she whispered, her grin audible in her voice. "First contact established. Subject displays high intelligence and curiosity when standard hunting patterns are disrupted." And she paused, touching the ground where the beast had stood. It left a message. A message. Zexivith's voice quavered. What kind of message? Madison traced the complex pattern of gravitational distortions left in the soil. An invitation. Same time tomorrow. And next time. Her grin widened. It wants to play. It's happening again. Madison whispered into her recorder, crouched in a different blind 3 nights later. The gravitational distortions are appearing in a Fibonacci spiral, 17 meters out, moving clockwise. In the observation room, Professor Kirkstall's carapace shimmered with excitement as they mapped Madison's observations against their sensor data. Where their most advanced equipment showed only random anomalies, she was seeing patterns. There, she breathed, pointing to a seemingly empty space. That's where it'll breach in 3, 2, 1. Reality fractured precisely where she'd indicated. The shadow beast emerged like oil flowing upward through water, its form rippling between dimensions. Several new students who'd come to watch gasped. The creature had grown larger since the first encounter. Fascinating, Madison murmured, sketching rapidly in her mud-stained notebook. It's not actually increasing in mass. It's learning to exist in multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, making itself appear bigger. She paused, then added with a hint of pride, "Show off." The beast's sensory pits flexed in her direction. Over the past few nights, Madison had documented an evolving pattern of behavior. The creature no longer tried to hunt her. Instead, it engaged in increasingly complex displays of dimensional manipulation. It's not just intelligent, she'd explained to her stunned classmates earlier that day. It's teaching me its language. Every gravitational shift, every spatial distortion, its communication. Now Madison stood slowly from her blind, her movements deliberate and smooth. The shadow beast tracked her, its head weaving in an almost hypnotic pattern. "Let's try something new," she whispered, mostly to herself. With careful precision, she began to walk in a pattern she calculated based on the beast's previous movements, a physical representation of its dimensional mathematics. The observation room erupted in chaos. "She's lost her mind." The Sisvith's tentacles writhed in distress. "That's the exact pattern it uses before a kill strike." But Professor Kirkstall raised a leg for silence, compound eyes fixed on the monitors. "Wait." The shadow beast had gone completely still, its sensory pits dilating. Then, to everyone's shock, it began moving in a complementary pattern to Madison's, creating a complex dance of spatial geometry. "That's it." Madison grinned, continuing her calculated movements. "You're not just a hunter, are you? You're a mathematician. Every kill pattern is an equation. Every dimensional shift follows perfect geometric progression." She completed her pattern just as the beast finished its own. They stood facing each other, separated by mere meters. Then Madison did something that made even Professor Kirkstall's mandibles drop. She turned her back on the creature. "Brooks." Val Knox's voice crackled through her emergency comlink. "What are you?" "Trust me." Madison cut her off. "Watch the gravitational sensors." Behind her, the shadow beast rippled. For a moment, the sensors went wild as space itself seemed to fold. When they stabilized, the beast had moved, not to attack, but to mirror her pose, its own back turned. "By all the sacred hives," Professor Kirkstall breathed. "It's acknowledging her as an equal." Madison slowly turned back around, and the beast matched her movement perfectly. "Movement log, night 4, she spoke clearly, knowing this would become historical record. "Subject demonstrates not just intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of spatial mathematics. Its hunting patterns aren't just for killing. They're proofs, theorems. We've been looking at it wrong this whole time." She took a step forward. The beast took one back, maintaining exact distance. "It's not just a predator. It's a scholar. And it's been trying to teach us, but none of your technology could translate its language of gravity and space-time." The beast's form rippled again, and suddenly the air was filled with complex patterns of dimensional distortion. Where others saw chaos, Madison saw equations written in the fabric of reality itself. "Time to learn your language properly," she smiled at the creature. Then she began moving in a new pattern, one of her own design. The beast's sensory pits followed her every move, its form vibrating with what could only be described as enthusiasm. In the observation room, Professor Exerkstall clicked in amazement. She's not just studying it anymore. She's dancing. Zixvith finished, his chromatophores glowing with wonder. She's dancing with space-time itself. The sixth night started like the others, but Madison felt the difference immediately. The air carried an electric charge that made her skin prickle, and the gravitational distortions were wrong. Something's off, she whispered into her recorder. The beast's patterns have changed. They're more erratic, almost desperate. In the observation room, alarms suddenly blared. Multiple dimensional breaches. Zixvith's tentacles whipped frantically across the sensor panels. They're not following any known patterns. Professor Herkstall's carapace paled. Brooks, evacuate immediately. Some things. The feed crackled with interference as reality seemed to tear itself apart around Madison's position. The shadow beast erupted into existence, but its usual fluid grace was gone. Its form flickered violently between dimensions, sensory pits wildly dilated. It's injured, Madison realized, seeing the way space warped unnaturally around its flank. Something's damaged its ability to control its dimensional shifts. Before she could move, the beast's erratic dimensional jumping destroyed her blind and equipment. Her emergency comlink sparked and died as a spatial rift cut through it. In seconds, she found herself surrounded by rapidly shifting tiers in reality, each one capable of shredding her at the molecular level. Brooks. Val Knox's voice came through the backup speakers in the trees. Emergency teleport in 3. No, Madison shouted. You'll just make it worse. The teleport field could destabilize its dimensional anchoring completely. She was right. The beast was barely maintaining its cohesion between dimensions. Any additional spatial disturbance could scatter its atoms across multiple realities. In the observation room, the assembled aliens watched in horror as Madison did the unthinkable. She pulled out her obsidian knife. She's going to try to fight it. A crystalline student chimed in disbelief. But Madison wasn't planning to fight. With deliberate movements, she drew the blade across her palm. The sharp stone parted her skin cleanly, and blood welled up black in the moonlight. What is she doing? Hestivith burbled in confusion. Professor Herkstall's antennae quivered. Watch. Madison raised her bloodied hand and began marking her face in precise patterns. 3 lines across each cheek, a stripe down her forehead, a final mark across her chin. Each movement was measured, ritualistic. The shadow beast, despite its obvious distress, focused its sensory pits on her. Its violent dimensional shifting slowed marginally. That's it. Madison spoke softly, never breaking eye contact with the creature. Focus on me. This is an old language, older than words. On Earth, when warriors met in neutral territory, they would mark themselves thus. She completed the final mark. It means I see you as an equal. I acknowledge your power, and offer mine in return. The beast's form stabilized slightly. Its sensory pits tracked the blood patterns on her face, recognizing the deliberate design. Madison began to move, not in the mathematical patterns they'd shared before, but in something more primal, an ancient Earth war dance, each step precise and powerful. Your mathematics are beautiful, she continued, her movements never faltering. But you're not just equations. You're a hunter, a warrior, like my ancestors were, and right now you need a different kind of language. In the observation room, the sensors registered something unprecedented. The beast's erratic dimensional frequencies began to align with Madison's movements. Impossible, Val Knox chittered. She's stabilizing its dimensional matrix through primitive ritual. Not primitive, Professor Herkstall corrected softly. Primal. There's a difference. The shadow beast's form solidified fully for the first time since they'd known it. In perfect synchronization with Madison's war dance, it began to move, mimicking her motions with its own dimensional shifts. Where there had been chaos, now there was harmony. human muscle, and alien spacetime moving as one. Movement log, final entry. Madison's voice was steady despite her racing heart. Subject responds to multiple forms of communication, not just mathematical. The key isn't just intelligence, it's respect. Sometimes you have to meet power with power, warrior to warrior, hunter to hunter. She completed her dance with a warrior's bow, hand over her heart. The shadow beast, fully stabilized, responded with a dimensional shift that bent space itself in a perfect mirror of her gesture. In the silence that followed, Professor Kirkstall spoke what everyone was thinking. "I believe, Ms. Brooks, you've just redefined interspecies diplomacy." Dawn broke over the preserve as Madison sat cross-legged on the forest floor. The shadow beast coiled around her in impossible geometries. Its form shifted between dimensions with deliberate grace, creating a living barrier that existed in multiple planes of reality simultaneously. "Remarkable," Professor Kirkstall whispered, watching through the observation feeds. "After last night's crisis, instead of withdrawing, it's protecting her." "Not just protecting," Madison's voice came through clearly. "Teaching. Watch this." She raised her hand, and the beast's dimensional shifts changed pattern. As its form rippled, small objects began appearing in the air around them. Leaves, stones, even tiny creatures, each suspended in its own pocket of warped space-time. "It's showing me how it sees the world," Madison explained, her voice filled with wonder. "Every object exists in multiple dimensions at once. What we think of as solid matter is just one slice of a much bigger picture." The beast's sensory pits pulsed in rhythm with her words, and more items appeared in the dimensional pockets. Some were familiar: twigs, insects, drops of water. Others defied description, objects that seemed to exist in geometries that human eyes weren't meant to process. "I believe," Valnox observed, mandibles clicking rapidly, "it's building a dimensional taxonomy, a classification system for reality itself." Madison nodded, carefully studying each suspended item. "But it's more than that. Look at the pattern of the dimensional pockets. It's not random." She pointed to the complex arrangement. "It's showing me how everything connects, how shifting one piece of reality affects everything else." The shadow beast's form rippled with what seemed like approval. It moved one of its limbs through space in a complex pattern, and suddenly the suspended items began to interact. A leaf aged rapidly, decomposing into soil, which nourished a seed, which grew into a new plant, all happening simultaneously across multiple dimensions. "Life cycles," Madison breathed. "But not just in linear time. It's showing how everything exists in all states at once, connected through dimensional threads." She turned to face the beast directly. "You're not just a hunter or a mathematician. You're a keeper of knowledge." In the observation room, the assembled xenobiologists watched in stunned silence as the shadow beast began what could only be described as a lecture. Through precisely controlled dimensional manipulation, it demonstrated principles of physics that made Professor Kirkstall's antennae vibrate with excitement. "The implications are staggering," the professor chittered. "If we can learn to understand its dimensional manipulation techniques." "We already have the key," Madison interrupted, never taking her eyes off the beast. "It's been trying to teach us since the beginning, but we were too focused on our technology to see it." She stood slowly, and the beast shifted its massive form to maintain their eye level. "Everything it does, every hunt, every dimensional shift, it's all part of a greater pattern, a language written in the fabric of reality itself." The beast's sensory pits dilated, and suddenly the air was filled with complex dimensional matrices. But unlike before, these weren't chaotic or threatening. They were organized, purposeful, a textbook written in gravity and spacetime. "Movement log, supplemental." Madison spoke clearly, knowing this would become part of scientific record. "Subject demonstrates not just intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of multidimensional physics that exceeds our current theories. Its hunting behavior wasn't aggression. It was trying to demonstrate principles we couldn't grasp. She reached out slowly, and to everyone's amazement, the beast extended one of its limbs, a portion of itself that existed in the same dimensional plane as her hand. When they touched, the contact point shimmered with possibilities. Furthermore, Madison continued, her voice steady despite the wonder of the moment. It appears to be part of a greater educational system. The dimensional matrices it's showing align with patterns we've observed in ancient ruins across the galaxy. This isn't just one creature. It's part of a multidimensional teaching network that's been trying to communicate with spacefaring races for millennia. The shadow beast's form pulsed with what could only be described as pride. In that moment, student and subject had transcended their roles. They were now colleagues in the greatest scientific exchange in galactic history. Professor Kirkstall's voice was barely a whisper. "Ms. Brooks, I believe you've just opened a door that can never be closed." Madison smiled, still connected to the beast through that shimmering point of contact. "Good," she said simply. "That's exactly what both of us wanted." The grand amphitheater of the Galactic Federation Academy buzzed with anticipation. Representatives from 17 species filled the crystalline chamber, their attention fixed on the central presentation area where Madison Brooks stood beside a shimming tear in reality, the shadow beast's chosen way of attending academic functions. In conclusion, Madison addressed the assembled xenobiologists, her dirty field uniform exchanged for formal academic robes. Our initial assessment of shadow beasts as purely aggressive predators was fundamentally flawed. They are, in fact, the galaxy's oldest teaching institution. She gestured to the dimensional displays floating around her, showing complex mathematical proofs written in gravitational distortions. Their hunting behavior was never about aggression. It was a filter, a test to find species capable of understanding their method of communication. The beast rippled, its form dancing between dimensions as it added its own annotations to the floating equations. Several theoretical physicists in the audience made sounds of astonishment as fundamental constants were rewritten before their eyes. But the most profound discovery, Madison continued, sharing a knowing look with her dimensional colleague, isn't about the shadow beasts at all. It's about us, all of us, and how we approach the unknown. Professor Kirkstall's antennae twitched with pride as his former student delivered the revelation that would reshape galactic science. In the front row, Zexivith's tentacles glowed with excitement, his fear of the shadow beast long replaced by fascination. "We assumed that advanced communication required advanced technology," Madison explained, "but the shadow beasts have been teaching us since before we discovered fire. Those ancient cave paintings we found across 1,000 worlds. Dimensional markers. The mysterious ruins that seemed to defy physics. Classrooms. We just couldn't see them because we were looking through the lens of our own assumptions. The beast demonstrated by creating a miniature representation of Earth's Nazca lines, revealing how the ancient drawings mapped perfectly to multidimensional equations. This is why first contact kept failing." Madison gestured to her companion. The shadow beasts weren't attacking observation posts. They were trying to enroll students. But our technology, our force fields, our artificial environments, they all created barriers to the very communication we sought. Velnox, who had become one of Madison's strongest supporters, raised a leg. "But how did you succeed where centuries of xenobiologists failed?" Madison smiled. "Because humans come from a death world. We evolved without technology, learning to read the smallest signs in our environment, because missing them meant death. When I approached the shadow beast, I didn't bring advanced sensors or protective fields. I brought something much older, the instincts and awareness that kept my ancestors alive." The beast rippled in agreement, creating a display showing the evolution of human pattern recognition alongside its own dimensional teachings. "This is why Deathworlders like humans make perfect intermediaries," Madison concluded. "We understand both worlds. We know technology, yes, but we never forgot the older languages, the languages of predator and prey, of survival and adaptation, of reading the subtle signs that nature writes in every shadow and sound. She turned to face the assembled xenobiologists directly. The shadow beasts aren't just teaching us physics. They're teaching us how to teach each other. Every species sees reality differently. True communication isn't about finding one universal language. It's about learning to translate between all of them. The beast punctuated her words by creating a cascade of dimensional windows, each showing the same scene from a different species perspective. The display was met with gasps of understanding from the audience. Today, we're announcing the formation of the Interspecies Communication Institute. Madison's voice carried through the chamber, a place where technology and instinct, physics and nature, modern and ancient, all work together. And our first professors, she gestured to the shadow beast, who rippled with scholarly pride, have been waiting to teach us for longer than our civilizations have existed. The applause that followed wasn't just for Madison or the shadow beast. It was for a fundamental shift in understanding. A recognition that sometimes the most advanced civilizations are the ones who remember their roots. In the back of the amphitheater, a young Centaurian student whispered to her neighbor, "Is it true what they say? That she still goes hunting with it every full moon?" Professor Kextel, overhearing, clicked his mandibles in amusement. Of course. After all, the best teachers never stop being students themselves.